able to come tonight who sent questions ahead of time, so I'm thankful for that. So tonight we're focused on an active solution that is going on in Seattle right now for housing for the homeless, temporary housing, and that is the tiny cabins. And we are very, very fortunate tonight to welcome Andrew Constantino, who is the assistant program manager for the tiny houses. And as we were waiting to come on, Andrew shared with me that he was there the day they built the first and set up the first tiny cabin down at Inter Bay. He has a long history and association and a lot of experience with those tiny homes in our city. And so he's going to be talking tonight about those tiny homes, all of the challenges that go along with supporting the infrastructure within our city, but also answering your questions about, and he encouraged you to ask all of the inconvenient and unusual questions that you might have. So I want to welcome Andrew and thank him for being here.
Hi, thank you. So I suppose I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Andrew Constantino. As was just said, that I've been involved from the inception of the tiny house villages, and even before that, like the steps that kind of led to it. And so, definitely if anyone has any questions or wants to stop me, I could pontificate for hours about, issues surrounding poverty and homelessness. So feel free to interrupt. I think that, some people know some of the story. Some people maybe not so much. That it was in 2016, I believe, that the city of Seattle created basically a permitting model that allowed for these communities to exist. And so that was with the mayor declaring a state of emergency around homelessness, and it allowed for the creation of 3 city-sanctioned encampments. Originally at that time, this was not envisioned as tiny houses. It was envisioned as places that people could camp, right? They could set up a tent. And it also wasn't like attached to any services being provided. It was more a way of saying, we don't want you camping at the park, but you may camp here. And so Seattle has a bit of a history with organized tent encampments. We can take a look around the city, especially during COVID, over the past few years, there's been a proliferation of tent encampments all over the city. They're everywhere, and some are quite large. The difference with like an organized tent encampment is usually when the campers themselves are imposing social norms. That has resulted in Seattle with the creation of organizations like Nicholsville or Share that kind of codify or structure that self-governing model, right? There are other examples of this as well, such as United We Stand, Camp Second Chance, and these groups are usually like gregarious personalities, that are living at the encampment, and they're like, I'm my brother's keeper, I'm going to make this a safe place to be. So if you're dangerous or you're threatening others or unstable somehow, then we will not allow you to camp with us. And so that's kind of the tradition, that this kind of emerged out of. The difference with the city offering a property, in those early days is many of the properties like the one on Dravis, which originally hosted what was called Tent City 5, which later became Inter Bay Village, is that there was no power, no running water, no food, no case manager, no staff, nothing, right? So it's simply a property. There were 2 others that were started in the same time frame. Inter Bay was the first one, and then there was one on Market Street in Ballard, which was even smaller, so you could only have about 15, 20 people there. And it was extremely controversial as well, that Inter Bay was much more welcoming than Ballard was. Ballard, fought it tooth and nail to not allow a dozen people to camp in a property that was not being used. Even though you have tent encampments everywhere. The third one was on MLK in the Othello neighborhood near Othello Park. That village still exists today, as does Interbay, though it moved. Othello is the one that remains of those three, with that it is only slightly changed over time. So I was there. It was on Thanksgiving Day. I believe it was 2016. And so we started, there's media and people from the city there. They're like, hooray, we're doing something to solve this problem. And so I had a little clipboard and a couple pieces of paper. And basically I was there to say, hi, do you want to camp here? Here's a list of 10 expectations. You're not going to threaten anyone. You're not going to hurt anyone. Sobriety was a requirement as well. So if you were to come to the camp and appear to be intoxicated, you could be asked to leave permanently, right? You may not return. And so that was because of, the light level of structure made it so any disruption, the camp couldn't handle it, right? That's how I would describe it. And so it was self-governing, meaning the camp would hold a meeting, they would make decisions collectively. And there is like a sublime beauty to that, but it is not without its faults as well, right? So someone who is charismatic is always going to do well in those situations, and someone who has more trauma, who doesn't express themselves as clearly, is going to struggle in those kind of peer environments, right? And I definitely saw that play out over time. So one of the things that made that a success, in many ways, I felt like there was an expectation that it would just go completely out of control, right? There's no order, it would fall apart, it would be unstable and dangerous. But there was so much support in the Queen Anne, Magnolia neighborhoods, and especially with the faith communities there, that it added this level of welcoming community to the group of people that ended up camping there. And it stabilized it, right? It made it a good thing that there was always water, there was always food, there was always propane, for cooking. There was always blankets. And it's because, the neighborhood was so good to that encampment. Later, the structure of the tiny house, there's a number of ways that it kind of came together. People kind of looking at that structure at a Lowe's, which, are very similar, like the garden shed. And also there were other groups that it was what can we get away with on a permit? And so on a permit, it was allowed, to have certain dimensions before it's considered a permanent structure. So at Tent City 5 early on, we would put a platform down, and that would make it so your tent wouldn't take water in. It was off the ground or off of gravel. And it would, just create a flat surface for you to prop it up. And then on the corners, we started doing beams, and that would make it so it would stabilize a tarp on a tent, something to tie it down to. And then, you cross the beams together to make them more stable, and more, without walls and a door, it had the framing of a tiny house. So I think that plus, kind of looking at other structures made people think, is this something that we could do? And on some of the permits, the original tiny houses, there were 5 at the Ballard one, none at the Interbay one, and 10 at the Othello one when we first put those in. On the permit, they were referred to as wooden tents, for all the sense that makes, right? So I think that was another hurdle to kind of overcome is, what are you actually allowed to do? And so, sometimes people will say, why not build the structure larger or taller, or, put a kitchenette in there? It's usually comes down to what we can do according to the permit that allows the village to exist. So in those first 3 sets of villages or encampments, the tiny houses were basically reserved for people with children. And most often folks that come, that have children with them won't stay very long. That, case managers, whether they're working for us or maybe they're working with a different organization like Kids Plus or Mary's Place, are going to try to rapidly place folks with children. And so it's much more temporary. They may stay at a tiny house village for a few months, right? And so then it just kind of looked like at Othello Village, we can get more structures. People like building the tiny houses, like some of you guys have experienced. And so more people were interested in constructing them. It was just a huge variety at the time. Like a family of 4 ends up building a tiny house in their driveway. Some Girl Scouts built a tiny house. And that is how we kind of got the structures, right? People enjoyed building them. They wanted to give it to the village. And so then one by one, starting really with Othello Village, we started replacing these tent platforms with tiny houses. Originally, these encampments were given a 1-year permit with a 1-year option to renew that permit, and then it's over. There wasn't going to be a negotiation afterwards. So with the Ballard encampment, it went a little over 2 years, but it eventually moved, and it moved to the Wallingford neighborhood, to a village called North Lake. And so Interbay moved from Dravis to Portland, where it exists now on 15th there. And during those moves, because of Othello Village, we had replaced tents over and over with tiny houses as they became available. We had extra tiny houses, and it just seemed like, why wouldn't we just convert the whole thing now? If we're going to move it, let's plan around a total conversion into just using the structures. And, the reason is not only is they're nice, but it's more dignified. People like them. They're very desirable. You don't have to convince someone who's in a tent, on the street if they want a tiny house. And many of the folks that you see camping around town, if I walk to them right now, I would say at least 90-95% would say yes to a tiny house. And so we just saw that it's what our clients want. It looks good. Like a tent encampment, no matter how neat and tidy you keep it, it still has this look that is really despairing. And I think the tiny house is easier to accept. It makes it so any neighborhood that it's placed in is going to be more welcoming of the little village, with these colorful little houses. And so that's an advantage, right? So when Interbay moved, it was fully converted into the village it is now. It's changed since then. But that also means that every tiny house has power now. Every tiny house has heat. We have trailers that have bathrooms and showers. We're going to build up the kitchen. And so we're able to add all these extra amenities to it. And let me see. So I think maybe I pause there in case there's like a question about it. I could describe as a program how the villages work.
I think that'd be really helpful if you could do that, Andrew. Like how do people get in? Is there a wait list? Is it difficult to get in? Is there criteria to get in? I know came up questions at the other one regarding, do people have to be substance abuse free to get in, or is that something that's handled once they're in? So if you could talk a little bit about that, and then how a village is run and supported, I think would be great.
Okay. And so, those are all hot topics. I think one of the strangest things about the villages is you would think, it seemed in the early days that allowing them to exist, getting a permit, getting any funding to operate it, or placing it in a particular neighborhood was the hard part. And later, what I found strangely is the most controversial aspect of the villages when they're opening is how does someone come to stay there? It seems like providers, the city, the neighbors, all want control over who can stay there. And there's a variety of reasons. I mean, one reason is that the reason we see so many people in the street is there is literally no place they can go, right? If we had a village that was open and had 50 houses in it, we could fill it today. We could fill it tonight easily. That's how great the need is. And so it creates a lot of tension over how do I get to stay at the village? The city, it has its navigation team. Maybe you guys have heard that term, later kind of rebranded, called the Hope Team, because the navigation team was a little controversial. And so basically, let's say I make a complaint about an encampment outside of my house. That complaint registers with the city. If they get enough of those complaints, it's eventually going to trigger that encampment to get swept, or to basically say, you can't camp here. You can camp anywhere but here. You know, that's really what the sweep is saying. And so that just doesn't, that's not like politically viable in a city like Seattle. You know, maybe in other cities that were a little more authoritarian, that would fly, but it doesn't go over very well in Seattle. So they have to look like they're a little kinder than that. And so being kinder means offering people another option. And so the villages create that option. It means, guys, you can't camp here. If I'm talking to folks at the park who are unhoused, but I do have a tiny house that I can offer you. Are you interested? And because, you know, these units are so desirable that, you know, people that have never stayed at one, they know how good they are. And so that's why we've seen, you know, so many of them created. So right now, as it works, is every village manager every single day gets a notification on their phone from the city, and it is like an application, and it will ding you every day at 4 p.m. and ask you if your village has any openings. And so we respond to it, and there are a few detailed questions like, is it ADA accessible? Do you allow children? And does this village accept people struggling with mental health or substance use issues? And so, you know, we answer those questions. And then the next day, someone from the city, from the Hope team, will call the village manager and say, hey, I have someone for your opening. And we're like, okay, we have like a list of basic criteria questions, so that the person knows what they're getting themselves into. You know, like we feel we want to be upfront with someone before they show up and have their heart broken. And so we kind of talk about that, and we're like, okay, this seems like it'll work. And so we make an appointment, like, what time do you think they're going to show up? Okay, about 2 p.m. I'll be here. I'll have time scheduled to welcome them and have them do like an intake, you know, to, you know, get their house, understand what the village is, set expectations. And then, you know, I mean, the best part is then I'm like, oh, here's some keys to your tiny house. Let's go take a look at it. And it's great, you know, it's a very fun experience to be able to offer someone that. You know, I've done hundreds of intakes at tiny house villages where someone arrives and I'm like, I'm glad you're here. You know, like, let's take a look around the village. I want to make sure you're comfortable here, that you think that we can make this work. And then we just have a conversation, you know, and I'm like, the thing, I want to help you. I want you to benefit from the village. And I just need you to make an agreement with me that you're not going to bring any harm to anyone here. If there's any problems, I just want you to come talk to me about it. You know, the last thing I would ever want is a scenario where I had to ask you to leave the village. And so I need you to communicate with me. You know, no matter what's going on with you, no matter what the situation is, just come and talk to me and let me have a chance to help you. We also have, you know, like our case managers have the services they offer. So they'll have extra things like extra paperwork if you need an ID or social. They'll help you get started in that process. But we like to have a decompression period. So when someone's brand new and they meet the village manager and they're welcomed into the village, we get them settled and set up, make sure we have a bed, make sure that we have like hygiene things for them, give them a tour of the village like they're a guest. Like we try to think of it as it's like it's a hotel and you're a guest at the hotel. I am treating you, as though you're renting the tiny house. That's how I see it, right? That you are a guest here. Anything you need some more towels, let me go grab some. And then I let people know that are new. I'm like, I do need you to meet with the case manager to start that process, but why don't you take a few days? For a few days, I want you to feel comfortable, get settled, feel safe. And if you have any questions, you can just talk to me about it. So we kind of keep it a little soft, right? Because when you've been outside for a while, I mean, some of our new villagers been outside for like 10 years, they've been through a lot. And so just being at the village is heavy. It's hard to feel safe again. And then I'll say that, originally, partially because of funding, we did the self-managing model where villagers operated the village basically, with some guidance of a staff person. I had done that for years. Now the villages are staffed, just to create consistent, reliable stability and safety at the village. And so 24 hours a day, we have what are called a village organizer, which is a staff person, and they are not the jailer. That is not their role. We make it very clear. You're not the cops, and you're not there to keep the villagers prisoner. You're there to be helpful, to respond to an emergency, and to be just a trusted adult present in case there is any conflict, any misunderstanding, just to be a mediator there. And then our village managers, often I see them, it's almost like they usually have pretty big personalities, kind of like a high school gym coach or, a teacher, they usually extremely friendly, louder personalities, who can deal with a huge group of people. And some of them are just like the most amazing people I've ever met. We're lucky to have them. At Inner Bay, we have Chris Brand. He's the village manager. Chris Brand is actually one of the founders of Camp Second Chance. And so he knows very well what the problems could be, what happens when people live like, the tiny house village is kind of like one building with many rooms. Usually the conflicts that arise are roommate conflicts, like your laundry is still in the dryer and it's 2 hours after it's been dry. Those are the kind of conflicts that are normal at the villages. As far as, other behavioral issues, so it's kind of like if all of us were going to build a village, I see it as the low-hanging fruit is let's help a group that's easy to sympathize with. So if we were to say, let's help single mothers who are unhoused, that is a very sympathetic demographic that most people would never oppose you doing something to help. Now, when we're talking about people with more severe behavioral issues, whether that is drug related, mental health issues, it becomes more difficult, right? People are a little less, have a little less compassion or patience for those that they feel are partaking of something that is immoral. But that is the work that I enjoy doing. The villagers that I love the most are the ones who need love the most. And so, over time, what we found was when we created extremely restrictive rules, saying you smell like alcohol, therefore I must kick you out of the village. What are we really accomplishing? Are we helping that person? Are we helping the village? Are we helping the greater social problem of homelessness and poverty? Or are we what is called creaming? Creaming means You are very polite and very nice, and you are difficult. So I'll work with the nice person and not the difficult person. So it's kind of I'm only going to work with those who are easy to work with. I don't feel as though that's the work that's really needed to be done. Someone has to face the difficult parts and the people that are really in dire circumstances and be willing to say, this isn't easy, but I'm here for you to help you. So there's two villages that are really considered to be harm reduction villages. And, that means people with very severe behavioral issues, delusional beliefs, maybe they're paranoid, that their addiction is pretty severe. And the rest of the villages, it's more akin to like a softer barrier, right? So that means if you are struggling with addiction, then we're going to try to help you. But what we're not going to do is punish you for failing to solve that today. We're not here to punish you. We're here to try to walk with you in your journey to be able to help you get through that, right? And I know people have mixed feelings about it. But I mean, even me, I do too. Sometimes I question how much am I enabling someone and how much am I helping them. But I think that is a moment to moment analysis of what you're doing. Is what I'm doing right now truly helping someone? And so I don't think that it's just a blanket answer to that. I think it's case by case, day by day.
Thanks for that, Andrew. I'm going to ask you a couple questions from folks who were not able to attend but had questions for you, which is how do people in the villages either get mental health support and care or medical support and care?
That's a good one. I would say that I'm not exactly sure what the most up-to-date statistic would be, but in general, Washington State, I believe, is 48th out of 50 in our country for mental health care. We are terrible at it as a state. And so often those resources are extremely scarce. And the same would be true of like drug treatment. And so no wonder we see these problems, right? So it's like we have at least one, often two case managers that work full time for a village. And it creates this advantage of you don't have to make an appointment with our case manager who may refer you to drug treatment or mental health counselor or help you access other services. Their job is to really navigate you through some of that when you're struggling. And also the village manager does a lot of it too. If a villager comes up to me and I'm managing a village and they're like, I've been really depressed, I've been thinking about hurting myself. Well, I take that seriously. And they're not going to leave my site until we have found some option for them, whether that's through like Valley Cities or therapeutic health services. So it's kind of like the villages create a place where you don't have to run across town to go meet and make an appointment with someone who can help give you guidance. We're right there, right? The case manager has a tiny house that's an office. You could come out of your house in your pajamas and meet with our case manager. We're there every day. We know our villagers so well. We spend so much time with them. It isn't just like an hour a week that we communicate with them. This is ongoing. I'm having a cup of coffee in the morning in the kitchen talking to 3 or 4 villagers. So I think we build deep relationships with the villagers and also with partnering agencies. So like I mentioned, therapeutic health services, friends of ours, another agency or Lifelong that does behavioral health and mental health and substance use. And they have offices in the village down in Lake Union, where we have people with more severe issues. And so we have the space, right? If you have the service, you can come to the village and say, we want to help people get signed up for Suboxone in case they're addicted to opiates. Well, sure, that sounds great. I'll actually spend days ahead of time talking to villagers and encouraging them to attend. You know what? I'll even buy pizza when you're going to show up, to help create extra incentives for people just to at least listen and of what you're offering. And the same is true of like medical care. So, I had mentioned before we started that the painting behind me is Dr. Lindsay painted this. She gave it to me. And when she was still a medical student, she was visiting a village that I was working for. And, she's making referrals to villagers. She's looking at concerns, talking to them about how they're feeling, their physical health concerns. And then like we're coming up with a plan. She's like, I'm going to make Johnny, the villager who is worried about his ankle, he hurt it recently, an appointment at this clinic on this day. Andrew, could you help them get a transportation there? And I'm like, absolutely. So I think that whether it's building the tiny house structure itself, offering the villagers, that safety in this group, or our partners that visit with us and get to know the village, become like a friend of the village, it is really community building, at all levels.
Thanks. I have two more questions that came in ahead of time, but I'd also encourage folks, if you want to drop questions in chat, to use that function, and then I'll stop monopolizing the questions after these two. The first one is related to families. That sometimes we, the ecumenical community, will hear about a family down at Interbay, and I'm curious about families, homeless families in Seattle. And I remember hearing something about a village that's going to be all women. And I'm curious how the tiny cabin, tiny home structure and system is adapting to accommodate and deal with families and support them.
That's a very good one. I would say that it's kind of like our internal thinking as we're kind of developing the village as a program, has really emerged into a bifurcation of a type of village. And what we found is that the most natural separation of style of village is a village that is orientated towards family issues, and villages that are orientated towards harm reduction. We don't really like that to overlap, though there could be parents who are struggling with addiction, right? But what we found is if people have serious behavioral issues, then we don't really want children exposed to that, right? It just seems like not a good mix, right? And so currently, that's kind of the focus, right? Like we just built a village in Skyway, and we knew from the beginning that this is going to be a family village. And so what that means is that with any partner that's making a referral to it, like I described, filling it out on my phone, then we make that clear, right? That if this village allows families with children, then what it doesn't allow is, severe addiction, severe mental health issues, that we don't mix the two. And so we do have villages that are very distinct. Like we have villages that absolutely do not allow children. And we have villages that do allow children, and we prioritize people with families. And so that would be, I would say Interbay actually is in a transitional period, that it is being the original encampment. It has undergone the most changes over time. It started as a tent encampment with no resources, and then it was self-governed. It was structured from a different organization. Then it was converted into a tiny house village, and then it was expanded upon. There was no staff. We added staff. There was no showers, bathrooms. And so I think the future of Interbay is the greatest need that the villages fulfill is typically for folks that are suffering from some level of behavioral health issue. And so we realize that that is the lion's share of the problem. And I think that the villages handle that quite well. And so Interbay still has 2 families at it. But we are intensely focused on uh, identifying exactly what the housing needs of those families are. And it probably will be, restricted after that. We won't favor having children there. We'll divert families to other villages, such as True Hope on Yesler. It is exclusively focused on families. And so there will be more villages in the future. I do feel as though one of the villages that had already undergone that process is Georgetown Village. It had quite a few children in it to begin with. Othello, in its first year open, had 25 children in it. So that need is there, but I just feel as though with every time we open new villages, we're refining our building process, the amenities offered, the services offered. And so instead of focusing on the older villages focus for families, I think that with all the lessons we've learned, we want to create new models that serve families better.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to just read you some questions from chat. First one comes from Liz Roach. At this time, how many tiny house villages are there in Seattle? And are there any in King County outside of Seattle?
It's crazy. I always feel like I'm like losing count, that there are so many. I believe that we're at 16, including all of them. But that includes like Olympia, Tacoma. So in Seattle, I think just walking through the ones in the city might be interesting because a lot of people don't know. The last one that we just opened is called Friendship Village. It's on 125th and Aurora. It is a harm reduction village. So no families with children, people with behavioral issues. Then the one that opened before that is Rosie's Village in the U District. It's on Roosevelt, how it gets its name. And you should definitely visit if you can. The manager there is like a heroic, inspiring woman named EJ. There's Whittier Heights Village, which is the women's only village. And it's often not talked about too much. It's most often for women who have suffered domestic abuse or escaping sex trafficking. And so it's kind of hidden, right? Then there's Interbay Village, which we've been talking about all night. There is True Hope, the family village on Yesler. There's Spirit Village, which is for BIPOC communities, so Native and African American. It is in the CD. There's Othello Village, which I've mentioned a few times. There's the village in Georgetown. Camp Second Chance is still present and is actually getting ready to undergo a huge upgrade, adding more amenities to it. And is there one I'm not thinking of? There's Lake Union Village, which is, obviously in Lake Union. And it is definitely for people with the most severe behavioral health issues. So those are the ones that are in Seattle. There's also one in Bellingham called Garden View. There is Skyway, Progressive Village, which a church offered us property. It's absolutely beautiful. And it's a family village as well. The Puyallup tribe, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing their name. We helped construct a village for them. And I love like the whole way that they built their village. Every single house has its own name, and it's gorgeous. And then there's Plum Street, Thames. These are ones that are in Tacoma. Also, there's another village that we built in Olympia on church property that only has like 8 tiny houses. So there's quite a few. It almost gets difficult for me to track them all, right?
And then we have a question from Becky. She's wondering, you mentioned the permits, that they only last for the village for 2 years. So does that mean at the end of the 2 years that the established village is dismantled and new permitted space has to be found, or what happens at the end of that 2 years?
So there's only been a few villages that have faced that crisis of what happens next. And so, like I described, there was the one in Ballard, which moved to Wallingford and got renamed. There was Interbay, which moved a few blocks and was rebuilt after its 2-year permit expired. There was also, the one that is like controversial, Licton Springs Village, which was the first harm reduction village, was very difficult. Once its 2 years expired, it was just allowed to expire and the village was deconstructed. And there was a lot of lessons learned there. I worked there as well. It was not easy. And so then after that, what it really seemed like is if there's one thing that we cannot lose, it's capacity. That if we imagine that we are going to create systems where you come and stay at the village and in 30 days I have you off drugs, got you employed, got you in an apartment, that is just not realistic. That the problems of homelessness and poverty are so deep that they are very difficult to resolve. And I'm saying this when in the past 10 days, we have placed at least 70 people into permanent housing. So like we're as an organization, we do everything we can to keep people housed or to get them housed. And still it almost seems insurmountable. And so that whole permitting time limit, it seems like it was just let go. Collectively, it just seemed like people were like, it wouldn't make sense. Why would you do this? The village is stable, it's helping people. Why would you end it? You're just going to put whatever group is currently there back out on the street.
Okay. This is from Nance, and there's several of them. Can you talk about what the inside of a tiny house looks like and how it's furnished? Who funds the village? Do the residents pay rent? Is this considered transitional housing? And how do volunteers work with residents? So maybe just start by describing the inside of one of the homes.
Sure. Back in the day, it was just blank. It had nothing in it, and I remember like in year one, where I would see someone come in and they didn't have a change of clothes. They didn't have a blanket. And I was like, what good is this house? The person is going to sleep on the floor tonight. And so over time, and I think that I think it's actually a good thing about the villages is that we learn from doing and then we iterate upon that. Like every village teaches us new things about how to meet people's needs and what makes the village good. And we adapt. And so now, like in the last village at Open, Friendship Village, I was there on the opening day. And me and the program manager for the villages, my mentor, Teresa, we have a bed frame. We're making everyone's bed. And here I am. I'm like, oh, well, here's some sheets and a blanket all folded up. I'll just set this here. She's like, no. We have to make the bed, Andrew. We want people to feel welcome. So she's like folding the sheets, going all out, right? And then also in it, we'll put like, I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like a metal frame that has spaces to hang things and shelves for storage. We don't want to use up all the space because it is kind of small. So we'll have that with some hangers hanging, and then we'll have towels. And we usually put something like sweatpants and t-shirts and socks, just so people have like pajamas basically. And then we'll add like a laundry hamper. And in the hamper, we'll have like slippers for the shower and hygiene items, deodorant, razor, toothpaste, all these like just basic essential items. And also every house is going to have a heater. And the heaters has a little remote control so that even if you're sleeping, you can turn it down or turn it up to adjust it. And, some of the houses have a little bit of flair where they may have like shelving or little decorative things in it. It just depends on the folks that are building it or painting it, if they add like a little bit of flair to the house as well.
And this is considered transitional housing, yes?
I would say, if we're talking realistically, it is.
Okay.
If we're talking legalistically, it is not. It cannot be that.
Okay. And do the residents pay rent?
No. So the original Tiny House Village, which was called Tiny House Village, is on 22nd and Union, on property offered by the Lutheran Church of the Good Shepherd. And so it had 10 tiny houses, but there was no city funding attached to it. So in order for the tiny houses to have power, then each villager had to pay $90 a month so that we could electrify the village. Since then, that has not been duplicated.
And where is the funding coming from for Lehigh to support the villages?
The majority of the funding, definitely in the ones in Seattle, is going to be from the city of Seattle. Now with the creation of the King County Regional Homeless Authority, the contracts that we get to do this, they will administer the money. But it is the city of Seattle that is putting money into the Regional Homeless Authority, and then they will be signing our contracts or releasing that funding.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the Homeless Regional Authority. We had two questions on that. How has that creation of that new authority been affecting the villages, and how do the villages fit in with that King County Homeless Authority?
Well, maybe some people have read the paper or an interview or two. It seemed like there was a tinge of animosity between the CEO of the Regional Homeless Authority, Mark Dones, and Lehigh, or the Tiny House Villages. They seemed critical of the model. And I definitely think that we seemed a little defensive, maybe a little overly so, which is interesting. And I could speculate as to the reasons why, if you really want me to, but I think that there has been some kind of tension. And what the outcome is, I think for 2022, the Regional Homeless Authority has only recently really got up and running to the point where it can administer the contracts that it'll be responsible for. And so they're not really inclined to make any sweeping dramatic changes in year one, really, of operation. So for now, things are okay. Hopefully that tension, that political tension between us and them will die down a little bit.
I want to echo something that Betty and Don added regarding the history of Interbay Intensity 5 and the role of that Magnolia Ecumenical Community in terms of providing that support, but also a lot of advocacy. So as the tiny cabins and the villages continue to evolve, how could that community continue to evolve to meet the needs? Like, what's the best way this community can be of support to the residents of Interbay?
I really think that, in the early days, it was just so obvious. Like the Tent City 5, the first encampment, having literally nothing. It was so obvious. The need was so great, and it really, with local churches supporting it, that's what made this possible to where we're at right now. And that does continue, in many different ways. Like I was describing the Skyway Village. Here's a church, Skyway Progressive. They have a piece of property. They're like, we want to do a village here. And we want to do a village that is providing, a place for people in our own community, and so being outside of Seattle, they were able to set different terms and conditions than we not always can do while inside the city. And so they also, provide other support. So it's kind of like adopting the village. And I really think that there is potential room, for other points of connection. One thing that I saw at Licton Springs Village is the volunteers who constructed House 23. they made it their mission, this couple, to always provide for House 23, no matter who dwelled there, right? And so that meant on Thanksgiving, they would stop by the village and they're like, we made dinner for House 23. And it's like, that's our focus. We are going to improve the lives of one person at the village or one couple at the village. And I think that that's really amazing. And it just feels like that could be furthered in some way. But I think that when a neighborhood or community group or church is in that neighborhood of the village, that really making it part of, your mission or, a way to care for a community. It's the villages, are on a shoestring budget, right? So it's like my friend Sue Olson, like the love that she has poured into Interbay Village is invaluable, and many of the villagers end up getting housed and moving on with their lives, which is what we want to see. But there are always new villagers who could always use a pair of shoes or towels or a holiday meal, and I think that part of that probably starts with uh, getting connected with the village manager. And, these roles do change over time, right? But I think that that's a good relationship to start with. Or just call me.
Let me lift up this compliment for you, Andrew. You are amazing. Thank you for this conversation and your work. It is my hope we can continue to support you in your work. I think that does a beautiful job echoing many of us who are on this phone. So thank you so much for your service to our community and all of the beloved people who live here in all those different ways that living is. So thank you to Andrew. I'll take the spotlight off. Feel free to wave, send your thoughts, encouragements, waves, acknowledgements to Andrew for this speech tonight. It was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much. For those of you online, I'll just tell you our next learning forum is going to be in February, and it's on February 28th. And it's all around critical race theory and what it is and what it isn't, and why it's being used the way it is right now in the world. And Dr. Cheryl Cook is coming back to help us with that and keep that work of unpacking and dismantling systems of racism in this world. So that is our February focus. So thank you all for coming tonight. Andrew, thank you again for your words and your wisdom. That was an incredible sharing. We really, really thank you.
Well, thank you guys for having me. And anyone, like, if you want to talk further about it or yell at me or I am open to it. I am open to any of it. Or if like you or your family or your church ever wanted to like take a look at other villages, just email me, let me know. I'm happy to help arrange it. I'll show up, we can look at anything you want.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, good night, everyone. Be well. Peace.